All right, so Mr. England here. We're going to kick off some review for your second practical on the skeleton system. Now, keep in mind this one's a little bit more detailed, but if you are prepared, it should be no more challenging than the first practical, the overview of the skeleton. If you have your packet or a list of all the bones necessary for the second practical, grab that out. If you have your book, if you have your PowerPoint, those will help you as well as we're going to keep going through this. So follow along. We're going to go through bones of the skull all the way down to vertebrae, scapula, sacrum, pelvis, femur, humerus. So make sure if you have these bones, if you're in the classroom, grab them so you can actually touch them. Otherwise, grab some type of utensil, study implement to help you follow along. All right, we're going to jump into the bones of the skull first. So up front, you've got, or on the back side, you've got your occipital lobe, or occipital bone, two parietal bones each side, one on each side. You got your frontal bone, and you got your two temporals, temporal and temporal. You got your ethmoid. Now the ethmoid, once you get inside here, keep in mind that this is a bone of the skull, so this one's going to be the top one. Once we get down to the facial bone, then you can come down and top to the facial for the lacrimal. But while we're talking about bones of the skull itself, the ethmoid is up top in the skull. And then your sphenoid. All right, on to the facial bones. So, as soon as I grab my here. Two nasal bones, nasal, and your vomer. This little thing sliding in and out back there. That's the vomer. Your lacrimal. Now remember, this is on the facial bone. Remember the ethmoid was on the skull bone, so that's attached to the skull. The lacrimal is on the facial bone, so that's on the face. Your zygomatic, both of these notches here that you can kind of grab onto. Palatine, we're gonna go underneath the skull. Actually, it might be easier with this one. Here's your palatine. Here's your maxilla. So palatine, maxilla. Sometimes on our models, they don't have the line through to see two different maxilla. But there are two different maxilla there, two palatine there. And then obviously, you should know what your mandible is. Now on our list, we do have the inferior nasal concha. In here, we only see the middle, to be honest with you. So I'm not gonna ask you questions on that one, but if you were just curious as to where that was, that's that. All right, so get back to the cranium for a second here. Your sutures, you got 4 of them. So we're gonna start here with your coronal suture. You've got your coronal suture, your sagittal suture. You've got your lambdoidal suture. Your lambdoid suture here, sagittal, coronal. Now on some of our models, you can't see the squamous as pronounced. This one is the best one I think we have, where you can actually somewhat see the squamous form there. So on some of them, you can't see it, but it is here. There's the pronunciation of the squamous suture. And again, coronal, sagittal, lambdoid going up over the occipital bone, and then the squamous on the side here of the temporal bone. All right, now we're gonna jump into some of the more detailed aspects of this review. So if you've got a bone next to you, try and grab it so you can follow along as closely as possible. Now on the front, on the mandible, you have what are called the mental foramen. I think these are easy to see on all of the models that we have, but if not, just kind of get a closer look. They are indented there. So mental foramen, one on each side of the mandible on the front part of your jaw. Make sure that's in focus there. All right. On the back side of the skull, you have what's called the external occipital protuberance. I think a number of times we talked about people that have migraines, people that get a lot of headaches. This is a primary attachment point for facial muscles, as well as those muscles that extend up from the neck. So if this is tight around this area, that'll pull on those muscles and create tension. So for those people that have migraines or headaches, a lot of times you can massage around this area first, and that should start to alleviate some of the pain. Jumping underneath the external occipital protuberance, follow along with the theme, occipital bone, external occipital protuberance. These are your occipital condyles, all right? Occipital condyles, one on each side. Staying in that central area there, whenever you hear the word foramen, you're going to want to think whole. So this is called your foramen magnum. Magnum, large, big hole, right? That's all this means, just big hole. All right, let's jump over into the inside of the skull here. It might be a little easier for some of us to see on this model. So I know some of these seem challenging, but keep in mind there's only three. There's only three of them that I think you should really say, okay, these are challenging, I should get myself to know these. We're gonna start with the jugular because I think that's the easiest to see on all of them. The jugular on all the models is gonna be the biggest one closest to the foramen magnum. Remember, big hole right here? Right next to that is the jugular foramen. So here's your jugular. That's the big one that we always hear about in movies. Here's your jugular. Right above the jugular, you have what's called your internal auditory meatus. So whenever you see the jugular, that first hole that's closest up to that, if you follow that hole all the way out, that takes you to your external auditory meatus, right? So that's where you can actually get into the inner ear. When people say don't stick Q-tips in your ear, we're starting to get into this dangerous area over here. So external auditory meatus, internal auditory meatus, very close to the jugular down here. All right, so that one should kind of take away a lot of the trouble. Another thing to keep in mind, the carotid canal we can't see on this top portion. You can only see from underneath the skull. So if you're looking at a view that's from above, you can only see the jugular and the internal auditory canal as well as the foramen ovale. So carotid should not be in your mind when you're looking up here. So on the topic of the foramen ovale, oval, here we are right here. So I think that's demonstrated a number of ways on all the different models. So here's the jugular again here. Here's the internal auditory meatus. On this model, it doesn't push through, but it's still there. Here's the foramen ovale. Make sure I'm in focus for you guys. Foramen ovale, jugular, internal auditory meatus, jugular, foramen magnum. So let's jump back over here. Foramen magnum, jugular, internal auditory meatus, foramen ovale, right? Foramen ovale. All right, so that takes care of the top side. Jumping to underneath, it's very, very similar. The one thing that comes up first is the fact that you now can see your carotid canal. So again, I'm gonna start here with your foramen magnum, all right? Foramen hole, big hole. Then you got your jugular that you can see from the inside and from the top view. You got your external auditory meatus, which we saw the internal on the inside. You've got your foramen ovale, and now you have your carotid canal. Now, once you start looking at your carotid canal, you're gonna wanna start looking back at that jugular because that carotid canal is very close to the jugular. Again, you can't see it from the top view, but underneath, once you find your jugular, right next to the foramen magnum, your carotid canal is gonna be the next biggest hole right next to it. So that's your big key. You've got three that I would say are challenging. You've got your jugular, you've got your carotid canal, you've got your foramen ovale. Those are the three holes that I think many people are struggling with. But there's some keys there. Jugular, right next to carotid, you can only see it from the bottom. Ovale, looks like an oval, right? So that's the other one that's on the bottom. On the outside, external auditory meatus. Internal is right next to the jugular. And then you always have the foramen magnum there. So that should take care of a lot of the confusion and challenge for the little holes and stuff on the inside. All right, real quick on the mandible. Again, you have your mental foramen on the front side. Got it on both sides, all right? Mental foramen. And up top, you've got two different notches here, two different nodules, I should say. These are the only two you need to know in the mandible. They're very, 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 very simple. You've got your mandibular condyle and your coronoid process, all right? Mandibular condyle, coronoid process, mental foramen. This is the mandible. All right, so next we're gonna jump over to the vertebrae. Now, keep in mind, you got three types, right? We already went through that in the first practical. Cervicals, examples of those. Thoracics, examples of these. And your lumbars. So lumbar, thoracic, and your cervical. Now, all of them have extremely similar characteristics. There are a few different things with some of them, which we're gonna go over now. Let's start with the lumbar. On the lumbar, all of them for that matter, you have what's called as a body. Let's focus you here. Here's the body of the vertebrae. So if this is your body, you've got what's called a pedicle taking you away from the body. to what are called the transverse processes. Transverse process, transverse process. Transverse, side to side, transverse process, spinous process. If you touch your back and you feel your spine, you're touching your spinous process there, protruding from the body. Spinous process. Remember we talked about foramen when we went over the bones of the skull. Whenever you hear the word foramen, you want to think whole. So this would make this the vertebral foramen, excuse me. This is your vertebral foramen, that hole in the middle there. Now again, that's present on all of your vertebrae, right? Vertebral foramen. On that atlas, it's a little bit larger, vertebral foramen. So body, vertebral foramen, pedicle, which is taking you from the body to the transverse process, right? Pedicle, right here, it's the little part here that you can almost kind of cut across. Body, pedicle, transverse process, spinous process, and then you have these little things that are pretty interesting. They're called your superior articular process and your inferior articular process. So you have that present on both the lumbar as well as thoracic. It is a little present on the cervical, just not as pronounced, i.e. I'm probably not going to ask you questions on that one, but these are the basic and more robust and pronounced characteristics of the lumbar and thoracic. Again, thoracic, you've got the same thing here. Here's your body. You've got a vertebral foramen, transverse processes, your spinous process, superior articular process, inferior articular process. Same thing on this one. This one looks a little bit different, but it's the same kind of theme here. Vertebral foramen, body, pedicle, taking you to the transverse process, spinous process, when you touch your back, you feel that. Superior articular process, inferior articular process. One thing to keep in mind here, if you're looking at this and you say, hey, I don't know if it goes this way or this way, right? I don't know if it goes this way or this way. This spinous process is always going to be facing down. So this is the correct way to look at this. Spinous process is facing downward, going down the back of the body. All right, here we go with the cervical vertebrae. Again, some of the things stay similar. Vertebral foramen, spinous process, vertebral foramen, transverse process. Here's a body, here's your spinous process, here's a pedicle. But then you have these two holes right here as well. These are your transverse foramen. So remember, transverse process, transverse foramen. Foramen means hole, transverse hole, transverse foramen. Moving right along, we're going to jump right into the scapula here. So on the scapula, a couple things to note here. You've got two different sides. So how do you differentiate these two different sides and the top side? So one thing that we're not really going to cover, or not going to have on the practical, this is called the lateral margin. If you want to remember so that tells you how that differentiates one side versus the second. That's not that big of a deal. What is a big deal is this little ridge right here. On the scapula, mind you, this is the scapula, not the vertebrae. This is called the spine. So here's a side view. This is the spine. Now, above and below the spine, you have what are called fossas. Now, fossas are, for lack of a better description, like taking an ice cream scoop and scooping out bone, right? You've got a fossa indentation here, fossa indentation there, and one on top. So if this is the spine, you've got above the spine, which you have a fossa, and you have below the spine, which you have fossa. Above the spine, you have what's called the supraspinous fossa, all right? Supraspinous fossa. Above the spine, fossa. Underneath here, which one do you think this is? Infraspinous fossa. Below the spine, fossa. All right? Supraspinous fossa, infraspinous fossa. And again, here's the spine. Now you have one more fossa on the mufasa. You have one more fossa on the scapula, right here. It's called your glenoid fossa. All right, let's make sure you're in focus here. This is your glenoid fossa. Supraspinous fossa on both sides, same thing. Infraspinous fossa on both sides, same thing. Infraspinous fossa above the spine, supraspinous fossa. Here's your spine, and here's your glenoid fossa. You've got two more things. You've got what's called your acromion up top, and you've got what's called your coracoid process on the side here. The only thing I can think of to try and help you guys is A, top of the alphabet, acromion, A, top of the glenoid fossa there, and then underneath that is your coracoid process. So acromion, coracoid process, glenoid fossa, remember your spine, then you have your supraspinous fossa and your infraspinous fossas. And just for those that want to go a little above and beyond, this is your lateral margin here, separating each side of your infraspinous fossas. And there is your scapula. All right, we're gonna jump straight into the hip bone here. So I understand some of you are confused between left and right, but don't worry about that right now. All you need to know is where to label things are. I understand in between the packet and the bone itself, trying to orient yourself accordingly is challenging. But off rip, I think the easiest thing to do is identify the acetabellum first, right? So I'm not sure if it was labeled or highlighted on the packet the first time, but you should know where your acetabellum is the first time you pick up a hip bone. Because once you find that, you can move straight to your greater sciatic notch. This is this little L-shaped thing on the side here. Acetabellum, greater sciatic notch, and once you highlight and identify those two, you can go straight down to your ischial spine. That's this sharp protruding thing on the outside here. So 1, 2, 3 things are already taken care of once you find this. Ischial spine, greater sciatic notch, and then guess what? Right below your ischial spine is your ischial tuberosity, right? Let's try and focus in on that there. Here's your ischial tuberosity. So ischial spine, greater sciatic notch, acetabellum. You've got 4 things taken care of just by finding this first. On the opposite side of your greater sciatic notch, you have what's called your iliac crest. Almost like cresting a mountain there. Let's back down. Like cresting a mountain there. So you've got your acetabellum, your greater sciatic notch, your ischial spine, that protruding thing on the outside there, your ischial tuberosity, and then your ischial crest. On the opposite side of your ischial tuberosity, you have your pubic symphysis. Now this is where the 2 hip bones meet. There's a piece of cartilage in the middle there. That's all well and dandy. But the first couple you got back here are the big takeaways. Here, it's kind of challenging to see with another hip bone, i.e. I can primarily ask you more questions about this, and this, with you just grabbing 1 hip bone. I would have to ask you to put 2 of them together for you to be able to identify this correctly. So just focus on your acetabellum, your greater sciatic notch, your ischial spine, your ischial tuberosity, and your ischial crest. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, almost done here. Gonna get to the femur and the humerus and a little radial and ulna, as well as the tibia, and then we should be done. So we're gonna start off with the femur. Largest bone here. Here's your head. It's the head of your femur. Nice little ball there, right into the ball and socket of the acetabellum. Those like we just talked about on the pelvis bone. This is the neck of the femur, your femoral neck. Femoral neck. Neck of your femur. Once we get down to the bottom here, a lot of people had questions, what's the medial versus lateral epicondyles? If you know here that this is the head of your femur, the medial is going to be on the inside of the body. Femur is going on the inside of the body. Medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. Keep remembering your directional terms. Lateral is on the outside, medial is on the inside, medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. This is your intercondylar fossa. Remember, fossa is like the ice cream scoop out of the bone. Inter and between 2 condyles, these are your medial and upper condyles. Intercondylar fossa, right there. So that should take care of most of the femur. Now, the 2 more interesting things for the femur, if you have your greater trochanter and your lesser trochanter. Let me look at it from this side. This is your femoral neck. This is the head of the femur. You have your greater trochanter here. You have your lesser trochanter. All right, so femoral neck, head, greater trochanter, lesser trochanter, medial epicondyle on the inside of the body, lateral epicondyle on the outside of the body, intercondylar fossa, right in between the 2 condyles. Remember, the femur of the head, the head of the femur is going to the inside of the body, connecting to that pelvis. All right, so real quick, last couple things here. You have your humerus here. Now again, similar to the femur, you have what's called your medial epicondyle on the inside of the bone, on the inside of the body, and your lateral epicondyle on the outside of the body. In between the 2, you have what's called your coronoid fossa. All right, so your coronoid fossa, remind me for extra credit, we've got 2 other things here, your capitulum and your trochlea. You don't need to know those for right now, but maybe I'll ask that as like an extra credit question. That's pretty much it for the humerus. On the ulna, you have what's called your trochlear notch. So that's that U-looking thing that we talked about when we were going over the ulna the first time. That's your trochlear notch. And on the other side, you have what's called your styloid process of the ulna. And you've got a styloid process of the radius as well, but this one is specifically of the ulna. So styloid process on both, styloid process of the ulna, and you have a styloid process of the radius. All right, guys, that's just about it. Two things to note. I did not bring home the tibia or the radius. So two things I got to show you still are the tibial tuberosity and the styloid process of the radius. But that's about it. Everything else seems to be covered well. So rewind, go back, slow things down, rewatch it over and over again. Do whatever you need to do to make sure you're prepared for this second practical. It is detailed. There's a lot. But if you study it early enough and hard enough, you should be perfectly fine to go. So if you got any other questions, just come see me. Other than that, Stringland's out.